The fluorescent lights above the conference room table buzzed like angry wasps as I sat completely alone, staring at the leftover birthday cake that no one had bothered to cut. 27 candles had been blown out an hour ago, but not by me. I wasn't even invited to blow them out. I wasn't invited to anything anymore, actually. The cake sat there mocking me with its cheerful yellow frosting and the words, "Happy birthday, Sarah," written in purple script that looked like it had been done by someone who actually cared. Someone who wasn't me, apparently. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The irony wasn't lost on me that I was the one who had organized birthday celebrations for everyone in our department for the past 3 years. I was the one who remembered everyone's favorite flavors, who stayed late to decorate the conference room, who made sure there were enough plates and napkins and that stupid plastic fork that never actually cut through anything properly. And now here I was, eating my own birthday cake alone while my coworkers were probably at Sullivan's Steakhouse celebrating my replacement. Yes, my replacement. The woman they thought I didn't know about. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me start from the beginning. Because what happened next will make so much more sense when you understand exactly how I went from being the golden girl of Morrison Associates Marketing to the person they were actively trying to erase. My name is Sarah Chen, and until 6 months ago, I thought I had everything figured out. I was 29 years old, living in downtown Seattle in a studio apartment that cost more than my parents' mortgage, but came with a view of Elliott Bay that made me feel like I was living in a postcard. I'd been working at Morrison Associates for 4 years, climbing steadily from junior account coordinator to senior marketing strategist, and I genuinely believed I was on track to make partner before I turned 35. Morrison Associates wasn't just any marketing firm. We were the boutique agency that tech startups fought to work with, the place where innovative campaigns were born and million-dollar brands were built from nothing. Our client list read like a who's who of Seattle's most successful companies, and being part of that success felt intoxicating. Walking into our glass-walled offices every morning, with their exposed brick and carefully curated industrial chic aesthetic, made me feel like I was part of something important. I had worked my way up through sheer determination and what my boss James Morrison liked to call my uncanny ability to understand what makes people tick. I spent my days crafting social media strategies that turned unknown products into viral sensations, developing brand voices that felt authentic in an increasingly artificial world, and managing client relationships with the kind of attention to detail that made million-dollar accounts feel like they were our only priority. The work was demanding but exhilarating. I regularly pulled 12-hour days, spent weekends analyzing competitor strategies, and fell asleep scrolling through engagement metrics on campaigns I'd launched. My personal life had taken a back seat to my career ambitions, but I told myself that was temporary. Success required sacrifice, and I was willing to make those sacrifices for the chance to build something meaningful. My colleagues had become my closest friends. Or at least that's what I believed. There was Marcus Rivera, the creative director, whose wild ideas somehow always translated into award-winning campaigns. He was the kind of person who could sell ice to penguins and make them feel grateful for the opportunity. We'd spent countless late nights brainstorming concepts for impossible clients, fueled by terrible coffee and the shared thrill of solving creative puzzles that seemed unsolvable. Then there was Jennifer Walsh, our senior account manager, who had a gift for making even the most difficult clients feel heard and valued. Jennifer and I had bonded over our shared experience of being 2 of only 3 women in senior positions at the firm. We'd grab lunch together at least twice a week, usually at this tiny Vietnamese place 6 blocks from the office, where the pho was incredible, and the owner remembered our orders without us having to ask. The third member of our unofficial trio was David Kim, our data analytics specialist, who could find patterns in consumer behavior that the rest of us never would have noticed. David was quiet and methodical, the perfect counterbalance to Marcus's creative chaos and Jennifer's client-focused energy. He was also the person I'd developed feelings for over the past year, though I'd never acted on them because dating coworkers seemed like a recipe for professional disaster. Our department worked like a well-oiled machine, with each of us contributing our unique strengths to create campaigns that consistently exceeded client expectations. We celebrated each other's victories, collaborated seamlessly on complex projects, and had developed the kind of professional shorthand that made us incredibly efficient. When one of us succeeded, we all succeeded. At least, that's how I thought it worked. The fourth member of our team was Amanda Foster, who had joined the company 8 months ago as a junior strategist. Amanda was 25, fresh out of Northwestern's integrated marketing program, and possessed the kind of boundless enthusiasm that reminded me of myself when I'd first started at Morrison Associates. She was smart, hardworking, and eager to learn, and I'd taken her under my wing almost immediately. I spent hours mentoring Amanda, sharing the industry knowledge I'd accumulated through years of trial and error, introducing her to key clients, and helping her develop the strategic thinking skills that separated good marketers from great ones. She shadowed me during client presentations, assisted with campaign development, and gradually took on more responsibility as her confidence grew. Amanda reminded me of myself in many ways, but there were differences too. Where I was methodical and detail-oriented, she was intuitive and quick to adapt. Where I built client relationships through consistent reliability, she charmed them with natural charisma and fresh perspectives. I admired her ability to see opportunities that others missed, and her fearlessness in proposing ideas that challenged conventional wisdom. James Morrison, our founder and CEO, was a larger-than-life figure who had built the company from nothing into one of Seattle's most respected marketing firms. He was in his early 50s, with graying temples and the kind of confident presence that made clients feel like they were in capable hands. James had a reputation for being demanding but fair, expecting excellence from his team while providing the resources and support necessary to achieve it. I'd always had a good relationship with James, who seemed to appreciate my work ethic and strategic thinking. He'd been the one to promote me to senior strategist, and he often sought my input on company direction and new business opportunities. During my annual reviews, he consistently praised my contributions to the firm's success and hinted at future leadership opportunities that made me believe I was on the right track. The Morrison Associates office culture was something I'd grown to love over my 4 years there. We worked hard, but we also celebrated our successes together. Friday afternoon happy hours were a regular tradition, usually held in the conference room with craft beer from local breweries and catered appetizers from whatever restaurant had caught James's attention that week. These gatherings felt like family celebrations, with everyone sharing stories about their week's victories and challenges. We also made a point of acknowledging personal milestones. Birthdays were always celebrated with cake and small gifts. Work anniversaries were recognized with thoughtful presentations about each person's contributions to the company, and personal achievements outside of work were shared and applauded. It was the kind of workplace culture that made the long hours feel worthwhile because you genuinely enjoyed the people you were working alongside. My own birthday celebrations at Morrison Associates had always been particularly special. 3 years ago, for my 26th birthday, the team had surprised me with a custom cake designed to look like one of our most successful campaign graphics. 2 years ago, they decorated my office with streamers and balloons in the brand colors of my favorite client. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Last year, Jennifer had organized a surprise lunch at the restaurant where I'd had my first successful client presentation, complete with a toast from James about my invaluable contributions to our continued success. These celebrations weren't just about cake and decorations. They were acknowledgments of belonging, confirmations that I was valued not just as an employee but as a person whose presence made the workplace better. They reinforced my belief that I'd found my professional home, a place where my hard work was recognized and my future was bright. Outside of work, my life revolved around the relationships and routines that supported my career ambitions. I lived alone in a studio apartment in Belltown, walking distance from the office and close enough to Pike Place Market that I could grab fresh flowers and coffee on weekend mornings when I wasn't working. The apartment was small but carefully curated, with modern furniture that looked sophisticated and a wall of books about marketing, consumer psychology, and business strategy that I actually read. My social life was primarily centered around my coworkers, which felt natural given how much time we spent together and how much we had in common. We'd grab drinks after successful client presentations, attend industry events as a group, and sometimes catch movies or try new restaurants on weekends. It wasn't unusual for work conversations to continue over dinner, or for personal conversations to spill into the office the next day. I stayed close with a few college friends who lived in other cities, maintaining those relationships through regular video calls and annual visits, but my day-to-day social needs were met by the people I worked with. This arrangement felt efficient and satisfying. Why compartmentalize my life when I genuinely enjoyed the company of my colleagues and felt like we were building something meaningful together? My relationship with my parents, who lived in Vancouver, was loving but complicated by their concerns about my work-life balance. They worried that I was too focused on my career, that I wasn't taking enough time for personal relationships or hobbies that didn't directly serve my professional goals. During our weekly phone calls, my mother would gently suggest that I consider dating more seriously, or taking vacations that didn't involve checking email. I understood their concerns, but I also felt like they didn't fully appreciate what I was building. My career wasn't just a job, it was the foundation for the life I wanted to create. Financial independence, creative fulfillment, professional recognition, and the opportunity to shape how brands connected with consumers in an increasingly complex marketplace. These goals required focus and sacrifice, and I was willing to make those investments for the chance to achieve something significant. The first subtle sign that something was changing came about 6 months ago, though I didn't recognize it as significant at the time. It was a Tuesday morning in early March, and I was reviewing campaign performance metrics for our biggest client, TechFlow Solutions, when I noticed that Amanda had been CC'd on email threads that I normally would have handled exclusively. The emails were routine updates about campaign adjustments and budget reallocations, nothing particularly sensitive or important, but the pattern felt unusual. When I asked Jennifer about it during our regular coffee break, she explained that James had requested broader team involvement in client communications to ensure continuity and knowledge sharing. This made sense from an operational perspective, and I appreciated that the company was taking steps to prevent any single person from becoming a bottleneck for important client relationships. Amanda was bright and capable, and involving her more deeply in client management seemed like a natural progression of her professional development. Over the following weeks, I noticed more small changes that individually seemed insignificant, but collectively began to form a pattern. Client meetings that I normally would have led were being restructured to include Amanda as a co-presenter. Strategic planning sessions that had previously been my domain were becoming collaborative efforts, where Amanda's input was given equal weight to mine. Campaign concepts that I developed were being refined and presented by Amanda, with my role shifting from creator to consultant. Initially, I interpreted these changes as positive developments. Amanda was clearly talented and ready for increased responsibility, and my willingness to share leadership opportunities demonstrated the kind of collaborative mindset that James valued. I told myself that supporting Amanda's growth was an investment in the team's overall success and proof of my leadership potential. But as spring progressed into summer, the changes became more pronounced and harder to rationalize as routine professional development. Client emails that had previously been addressed directly to me were being sent to Amanda with me included as a secondary recipient. Strategic decisions that I had traditionally made independently were requiring Amanda's input and approval. Most tellingly, my invitations to high-level planning meetings were becoming less frequent, while Amanda's participation in those same meetings was increasing. The shift was gradual enough that I couldn't point to any single incident as proof that something was wrong, but cumulative enough that I began to feel uneasy about my position within the team. When I tried to discuss my concerns with Jennifer, she assured me that the changes reflected the company's commitment to developing junior talent and building more robust client relationships. Marcus offered similar reassurances, emphasizing that my expertise was still valued and that sharing responsibilities would ultimately benefit everyone. David's responses to my concerns were more ambiguous. He acknowledged that team dynamics were shifting, but suggested that adaptation and flexibility were essential skills in our rapidly changing industry. His advice was to focus on demonstrating my value through excellent work, rather than worrying about organizational changes that might be temporary. This counsel felt reasonable if not entirely satisfying, and I tried to follow it while monitoring the situation for further developments. The most troubling aspect of these changes wasn't their professional implications but their personal impact on my relationships with my colleagues. Conversations that had previously felt natural and inclusive were becoming more guarded and formal. Friday afternoon happy hours continued, but the topics of discussion seemed carefully chosen to avoid anything that might relate to my changing role within the team. Social invitations that had once been automatic were becoming less frequent, and when they did occur, they felt obligatory rather than genuine. I began to notice subtle signs that conversations were happening without me. References to decisions that had been made during meetings I wasn't aware of, inside jokes that excluded me, and strategic directions that seemed to have been determined through discussions I hadn't participated in. These observations were frustrating and isolating, but they were also difficult to address directly without seeming paranoid or professionally insecure. The situation reached a turning point in late July, when I discovered that Amanda had been assigned as the primary strategist for a major new client presentation that I had been developing for weeks. The client was a promising fintech startup that represented exactly the kind of innovative, high-growth company that Morrison Associates was known for launching successfully. I had spent countless hours researching their market position, analyzing their target demographics, and developing a comprehensive brand strategy that I believed could transform their business. When James announced that Amanda would be presenting the strategy to the client, he framed the decision as an opportunity for her to demonstrate her readiness for senior-level responsibilities. He praised my research and strategic development work while explaining that Amanda's fresh perspective and presentation skills made her the ideal person to deliver the pitch. The announcement was made during our regular Monday morning team meeting, in front of everyone, with no prior discussion or warning. I felt like I'd been punched in the stomach. This wasn't just about losing a single presentation opportunity. It was about watching weeks of my creative and strategic work being handed to someone else to present as their own. The fintech client represented the kind of account that could define a career, and I'd invested everything I had into developing an approach that I believed could set both the client and the agency up for tremendous success. But what hurt even more than losing the presentation was the realization that the decision had been made without any input from me. No conversation about my availability, my interest in continuing to lead the account, or my feelings about transferring the work to Amanda. The decision was presented as final and non-negotiable, leaving me with no choice but to accept it gracefully, or risk seeming unprofessional and resistant to change. I chose to accept it gracefully, at least outwardly. I congratulated Amanda on the opportunity, offered to brief her on the strategic research I'd completed, and assured James that I was committed to supporting the team's success regardless of my specific role. But privately, I was devastated and increasingly concerned about what these changes meant for my future at Morrison & Associates. The fintech presentation went exceptionally well, largely because Amanda was indeed a gifted presenter and because the strategic foundation I'd developed was solid. The client signed a significant contract, and Amanda received well-deserved recognition for her successful pitch. James praised her performance during our next team meeting, describing it as evidence of the company's commitment to developing emerging talent and building a leadership pipeline for the future. I applauded Amanda's success along with everyone else, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was watching my own professional accomplishments being attributed to someone else. The strategy, the research, the innovative approaches that had won the client over were largely my work, but Amanda was receiving the credit and the career advancement opportunities that came with that recognition. It felt like watching someone else live the professional life I'd been building for myself. August brought more of the same patterns, but with increasing intensity and less attempt to maintain the pretense that these were temporary or developmental changes. Client meetings were being scheduled without me, strategic planning sessions were happening during times when I was told I wasn't needed, and my input on major decisions was being sought less frequently. Amanda, meanwhile, was taking on more high-visibility projects, building stronger relationships with key clients, and being included in conversations about the company's future direction. The social dynamics within the team were becoming increasingly uncomfortable. Lunch invitations that had once been routine were becoming rare, and when I did join my colleagues for meals, the conversation felt strained and artificial. References to plans, decisions, and developments that I knew nothing about became more frequent, creating a constant undercurrent of exclusion that made every interaction feel fraught with unspoken tension. I began to suspect that conversations about my future at the company were happening regularly, just not with my participation. The evidence was circumstantial, but accumulating. Hushed conversations that stopped when I approached, knowing looks exchanged during meetings, and a general atmosphere of careful politeness that felt completely different from the easy camaraderie we'd shared for years. The most painful aspect of this period was my growing realization that the relationships I'd treasured were perhaps not as genuine as I'd believed. People I'd considered close friends were participating in what felt like a systematic effort to marginalize me professionally and socially. The birthday celebrations, the Friday happy hours, the collaborative projects, and the personal conversations that had made Morrison Associates feel like a second family were revealed to be more fragile and conditional than I'd ever imagined. September brought a development that made the situation impossible to ignore or rationalize away. During a routine review of company email protocols, I discovered that a new email distribution list had been created for senior strategy discussions. The list included Marcus, Jennifer, David, Amanda, and James, but not me. This wasn't an oversight or a temporary exclusion. It was a deliberate decision to formalize my removal from strategic planning conversations. When I asked Jennifer about the email list, she explained that it had been created to streamline communications for a specific client project that didn't require my direct involvement. But when I reviewed the subject lines of the emails in question, it became clear that they covered general strategic planning topics that absolutely should have included my input. I was being systematically excluded from conversations that were central to my job responsibilities and professional development. This discovery forced me to confront the reality that my colleagues weren't just allowing my marginalization to happen, they were actively participating in it. People I'd trusted, mentored, collaborated with, and considered friends were making deliberate choices to exclude me from important discussions and decision-making processes. The betrayal felt personal and professional simultaneously, cutting to the core of both my career identity and my understanding of the relationships that had anchored my adult life. I spent that weekend alone in my apartment, trying to process what I'd learned and decide how to respond. Part of me wanted to confront the situation directly, to demand explanations and fight for my place within the team. But another part of me recognized that if my colleagues and my boss had made a collective decision to move forward without me, confronting them might only accelerate whatever process was already underway. The following Monday morning brought what felt like a moment of clarity, though not the kind I'd been hoping for. As I walked into the office, I noticed Amanda sitting in what had traditionally been my spot during our weekly team meetings. When I sat in a different chair, no one commented or suggested that I move to my usual place. The meeting proceeded with Amanda taking the lead on several agenda items that I normally would have handled, and my contributions to the discussion were acknowledged politely, but without the enthusiasm or engagement that had characterized our previous collaborations. After the meeting, I lingered in the conference room for a few minutes, ostensibly organizing my notes but actually trying to process the symbolic significance of what had just happened. My seat at the table, literally and figuratively, was being occupied by someone else, and no one seemed to think this required explanation or discussion. I was becoming a peripheral figure in an organization where I'd once been central, and the transition was happening so smoothly that it felt rehearsed. October was a month of increasing isolation and decreasing responsibilities. Projects that I'd been leading were transferred to Amanda with minimal explanation, client relationships that I'd built over years were being handled by other team members, and my input on strategic decisions was sought less frequently and treated as less valuable when it was requested. I felt like I was disappearing professionally, becoming invisible within an organization where I'd once been indispensable. The social isolation was equally painful and more personally devastating. Friday happy hours continued, but my participation felt tolerated rather than welcomed. Conversations about weekend plans, personal developments, and professional goals excluded me in ways that seemed deliberate rather than accidental. The easy friendships that had sustained me through years of demanding work were being replaced by polite professional courtesy that maintained surface civility while eliminating genuine connection. I found myself eating lunch alone more often, spending breaks at my desk rather than in the common areas where my colleagues gathered, and leaving the office immediately after work rather than participating in the informal social activities that had once been central to my identity at Morrison Associates. This isolation was partly imposed by others and partly chosen by me as a way of avoiding the constant reminders that I was no longer fully included in the team's professional and personal life. By early November, the pattern was clear and undeniable. I was being systematically marginalized within the organization, with my responsibilities transferred to Amanda, and my relationships with colleagues becoming increasingly formal and distant. The process had been gradual enough to maintain plausible deniability, but comprehensive enough to fundamentally alter my role within the company. I was still employed, still receiving my salary, and still nominally part of the senior strategy team, but my actual influence and involvement had been reduced to a fraction of what they'd been 6 months earlier. The question that haunted me during this period was whether I was witnessing the natural evolution of organizational priorities or deliberate professional sabotage. Were these changes the result of Amanda's exceptional performance and my own declining value to the company, or were they part of a coordinated effort to ease me out of my position? The distinction mattered because it would determine how I should respond and what my future at Morrison Associates might look like. What made the situation particularly difficult to navigate was the absence of clear wrongdoing or obvious mistreatment. No one was hostile or unprofessional in their interactions with me. My work was still valued when it was requested, and my opinions were still solicited occasionally during team discussions. But the cumulative effect of dozens of small changes was the erosion of my position within the organization and my relationships with people I'd considered friends. The week before my birthday, I made a decision that felt both terrifying and liberating. I scheduled a meeting with James to discuss my concerns about my changing role within the company and to seek clarity about my future prospects at Morrison & Associates. I prepared carefully for the conversation, documenting the specific changes I'd observed and the impact they were having on my professional development and job satisfaction. The meeting was scheduled for the Friday before my birthday, giving me the weekend to process whatever information James might share about the company's plans for my position. I approached the conversation with a mixture of hope and dread, understanding that it might provide the clarity I needed, while also potentially confirming my worst fears about how my colleagues viewed my value to the organization. James's office was a shrine to Morrison & Associates' success, with framed awards, client testimonials, and photographs from company celebrations covering every available wall space. Sitting across from his desk, surrounded by evidence of the achievements I'd contributed to over 4 years, I felt both proud of what we'd accomplished together and uncertain about whether I'd continue to be part of that success story. The conversation began with James praising my contributions to the company and acknowledging the excellence of my work over the years. He spoke warmly about my strategic thinking, my client relationship skills, and my commitment to the organization's success. But as he continued talking, I realized that his praise was delivered in the past tense, as if he were eulogizing my career at Morrison & Associates, rather than discussing my future there. When I raised my concerns about my changing role and decreasing responsibilities, James acknowledged that the team dynamics had evolved as Amanda had demonstrated her capabilities and taken on more leadership opportunities. He framed these changes as positive developments for the organization's future, emphasizing the importance of developing emerging talent and building a strong leadership pipeline. What he didn't say was more telling than what he did. He didn't reassure me about my future with the company, didn't address my concerns about being excluded from strategic planning conversations, and didn't offer any concrete steps for restoring my previous level of involvement in key decisions. Instead, he suggested that I consider how I might adapt to the organization's evolving needs and find new ways to contribute to our collective success. The meeting lasted 30 minutes and ended with James thanking me for bringing my concerns to his attention and promising to consider how to better utilize my skills and experience in the future. But his body language and tone conveyed a different message. My time at Morrison & Associates was drawing to a close, and the only question was whether I would recognize that reality and act accordingly, or force them to make the transition more explicitly. I left James's office feeling like I'd just attended my own professional funeral. The praise, the careful language about organizational evolution, and the absence of any concrete reassurances about my future made it clear that my colleagues had already decided to move forward without me. The only question remaining was how and when that transition would be formalized. That weekend, alone in my apartment overlooking Elliott Bay, I tried to process everything that had happened over the past 8 months. The gradual erosion of my responsibilities, the systematic exclusion from important conversations, the cooling of relationships that had once sustained me professionally and personally. And finally, the carefully worded dismissal, disguised as a performance review. All of it pointed to a coordinated effort to ease me out of the organization while minimizing disruption and avoiding the complications of a direct termination. Monday morning brought an unexpected development that crystallized everything I'd been suspecting but hadn't been able to prove. As I arrived at the office early to prepare for the week ahead, I noticed that Amanda was already at her desk, working on what appeared to be a presentation about organizational restructuring. When she saw me approaching, she quickly minimized the document on her computer screen, but not before I caught a glimpse of an organizational chart that showed the senior strategy team without my name on it. The image burned itself into my memory. My position, my responsibilities, and my future at Morrison Associates, represented by an empty space where my name should have been. Amanda would be taking over my clients, my projects, and my role within the organization, while I would simply disappear from the company's structure as if I'd never been there at all. That Tuesday, November 15th, was my 29th birthday. I arrived at the office expecting some acknowledgement of the day, perhaps a small celebration like the ones we'd shared for everyone else's birthdays throughout the year. Instead, I found my colleagues engaged in their usual morning routines, with no mention of my birthday and no evidence that anyone had remembered or planned any kind of recognition. By lunchtime, it became clear that my birthday was being deliberately ignored. No cake appeared in the conference room, no decorations materialized on my desk, and no suggestions were made for the kind of group celebration that had become standard practice for team members' birthdays. The silence was deafening and unmistakably intentional. I spent my lunch break walking around Pike Place Market, trying to understand how relationships that had once felt authentic and caring could disappear so completely. The colleagues who had celebrated my previous birthdays with enthusiasm and thoughtfulness were now treating the day as if it were any other Tuesday, as if I were just another employee, rather than someone they'd shared years of professional and personal experiences with. When I returned to the office, I found a birthday cake in the conference room, but it wasn't for me. Someone had ordered a cake for Amanda, whose birthday was apparently the following week, and they were using my actual birthday as an opportunity to celebrate her instead. The symbolism was brutal and unmistakable. I was being replaced in every aspect of my professional life, including the small personal acknowledgments that made workplace relationships feel meaningful. I watched through the conference room glass as my colleagues gathered around Amanda, singing "Happy Birthday," with the same enthusiasm they'd once shown for my celebrations. Marcus was taking photos, Jennifer was serving cake, David was making jokes, and James was delivering what appeared to be a speech about Amanda's bright future with the company. It was exactly the kind of celebration I'd organized for others and received myself in previous years, except now I was the spectator rather than the honored guest. The cake-cutting ceremony lasted about 20 minutes, with everyone enjoying dessert and casual conversation while I sat at my desk, pretending to work on emails and trying to process the emotional impact of watching my replacement being celebrated on my birthday. When the party ended and everyone returned to their desks, the conference room was left exactly as it had been, with the remainder of Amanda's cake sitting on the table like evidence of my professional invisibility. That's when I decided to stay late and cut myself a piece of the cake that should have been mine. Not Amanda's cake, which felt like it would be stealing, but the cake that represented the birthday celebration I should have received if my colleagues had remembered that I existed and mattered. I sat alone in that conference room, eating birthday cake in the dark because I was too proud to turn on the lights and advertise my pathetic situation to anyone who might still be in the office. As I sat there in the semi-darkness, eating cake with a plastic fork and listening to the building's ventilation system hum above my head, I realized that this moment represented the lowest point of my professional life. Not because I'd been passed over for a promotion or criticized for poor performance, but because I'd allowed myself to become so invisible that my own colleagues felt comfortable erasing me from their lives without explanation or acknowledgement. But sitting there in that empty conference room, with crumbs from someone else's birthday cake on my blouse, and the taste of artificial vanilla frosting in my mouth, I also felt something I hadn't experienced in months. Clarity. The fog of confusion and self-doubt that had surrounded me since the spring finally lifted, replaced by a crystal-clear understanding of exactly what had been happening and exactly what I needed to do about it. My colleagues thought they could replace me quietly and painlessly, easing me out of the organization while avoiding the mess and complications of a direct confrontation. They thought they could transfer my responsibilities, exclude me from their conversations, and ignore my contributions until I simply faded away or found another job. They thought wrong. I spent the rest of that evening alone in the conference room, not eating cake but planning what would become the most memorable birthday celebration in Morrison Associates history, though not for the reasons anyone expected. I was done being invisible, done being ignored, and done allowing other people to write the story of my professional life without my input. By the time I finally left the office that night, I had a complete strategy for how I would respond to 8 months of systematic marginalization and professional betrayal. It would be elegant, devastating, and absolutely unforgettable. They had given me a birthday I would never forget by not giving me one at all. Now I was going to return the favor. The next morning arrived gray and drizzling, typical Seattle weather that matched my mood perfectly as I walked through the revolving doors of Morrison Associates, for what I suspected might be one of my final weeks there. The security guard, Miguel, greeted me with his usual warm smile and asked how my birthday had been. His genuine concern was such a stark contrast to my colleagues' indifference that I almost started crying right there in the marble lobby. I'd spent most of the night lying awake, staring at the ceiling of my studio apartment and replaying every interaction from the past 8 months. What had started as isolated incidents now formed a clear pattern of deliberate exclusion and systematic replacement. The birthday cake incident wasn't just thoughtless oversight. It was the culmination of a carefully orchestrated plan to erase me from the organization while celebrating my successor. But something had shifted during those dark hours between midnight and dawn. The hurt and confusion that had paralyzed me for months had crystallized into something sharper and more focused. I was no longer the naive employee hoping for explanations and reassurances. I was someone who finally understood the game being played, and was ready to play it better than anyone expected. My first stop was the kitchen area, where I made myself coffee with deliberate precision, taking time to observe the morning routines of my colleagues without seeming to pay attention. Marcus arrived at his usual time, immediately disappearing into his office with barely a nod in my direction. Jennifer breezed through 20 minutes later, her phone pressed to her ear as she discussed weekend plans with someone who clearly wasn't a coworker. David appeared shortly after, carrying his laptop bag and wearing the slightly rumpled look of someone who'd worked late the night before. Amanda was already at her desk when I arrived, despite the fact that her official start time wasn't for another 30 minutes. She was reviewing what appeared to be client files, making notes in the margins with the kind of focused intensity that I recognized from my own early days at the company. The sight of her industriousness would have impressed me 8 months ago. Now it felt like watching someone rehearsing for a role they'd already been promised. The morning proceeded with an artificially normal atmosphere that felt more oppressive than open hostility would have been. Emails were exchanged about routine matters, meetings were scheduled for later in the week, and project updates were shared with the kind of professional courtesy that maintained surface civility while concealing deeper currents of tension and deception. At 10:30, my phone buzzed with a calendar invitation that made my stomach drop. James had scheduled a one-on-one meeting for Friday afternoon, with the subject line reading simply, discussion. No agenda, no context, no indication of what we would be discussing, but the timing and formality suggested that this would be the conversation where my future at Morrison & Associates would be officially decided. I accepted the meeting invitation with a brief response acknowledging the appointment, but my mind was already racing ahead to what that conversation might entail. Would James offer me a severance package in exchange for a quiet resignation? Would he present a restructuring plan that eliminated my position while creating new opportunities for Amanda? Would he simply inform me that my services were no longer needed and expect me to clean out my desk by the end of the day? The uncertainty was almost worse than knowing the outcome would be. At least with concrete information, I could plan my response and maintain some control over how the situation unfolded. But the ambiguity left me suspended between hope and despair, unable to fully prepare for any specific scenario while trying to brace myself for all possible outcomes. By lunchtime, I'd made a decision that surprised even me. Instead of eating alone at my desk or venturing out to avoid my colleagues, I walked directly to Jennifer's office and knocked on her open door. She looked up from her computer with an expression of polite surprise, as if she hadn't expected me to initiate a conversation. "Do you have a few minutes to talk?" I asked, keeping my voice neutral and professional despite the adrenaline coursing through my system. Jennifer glanced at her watch and then at her computer screen, performing a brief calculation that I interpreted as her weighing the inconvenience of the conversation against the potential awkwardness of declining. "Of course," she said finally, gesturing toward the chair across from her desk. "What's on your mind?" I closed her office door behind me and sat down, taking a moment to organize my thoughts before speaking. This conversation could go several different ways, depending on how honest Jennifer was willing to be and how much she was willing to admit about what had been happening over the past months. "I wanted to talk about the team dynamics," I began, choosing my words carefully. "I've noticed some changes in how projects are being assigned and how decisions are being made, and I'm trying to understand whether these changes are temporary or part of a longer-term restructuring." Jennifer's expression remained carefully neutral, but I caught a brief flicker of something that might have been guilt or discomfort. "What kind of changes are you referring to?" she asked, though her tone suggested that she knew exactly what I was talking about. I spent the next 10 minutes outlining the specific incidents I'd observed. The email distribution lists that excluded me, the client meetings I was no longer invited to attend, the strategic planning sessions that happened without my input, and the gradual transfer of my responsibilities to Amanda. I kept my tone factual and professional, presenting the information as observations rather than accusations. Jennifer listened without interrupting, occasionally nodding or making notes on a legal pad, but her body language became increasingly tense as I continued speaking. When I finished, she was quiet for several moments, apparently considering how much she was willing to reveal about what she knew. "Sarah," she said finally, "I think you're reading too much into normal business evolution. Amanda has been performing exceptionally well, and it's natural that she would take on increased responsibilities as she demonstrates her capabilities. These changes aren't about diminishing your role, they're about maximizing everyone's potential contributions." The response was exactly what I'd expected, a careful deflection that acknowledged my concerns while denying their significance. Jennifer was offering me the same kind of reassurance that she'd been providing for months, the professional equivalent of patting me on the head and telling me not to worry about things I couldn't understand. "I appreciate that perspective," I replied, "but I'm specifically concerned about being excluded from strategic planning conversations and having my client relationships transferred without discussion. These changes feel coordinated rather than organic, and I'd like to understand the rationale behind them." Jennifer's pause lasted longer this time, and when she spoke, her voice had a slight edge that hadn't been there before. "Sarah, I think you need to consider the possibility that you're feeling threatened by Amanda's success because you're not used to sharing leadership responsibilities. This kind of territorial behavior isn't healthy for team dynamics or your own professional development." The accusation hit like a slap across the face. Jennifer was reframing my legitimate concerns about professional marginalization as petty jealousy and resistance to collaboration. She was making me the problem, suggesting that my observations were distorted by insecurity rather than grounded in objective reality. I felt my carefully maintained composure beginning to crack, but I forced myself to remain calm and measured in my response. "I don't think this is about territoriality or resistance to collaboration," I said. "I've been mentoring Amanda since she joined the company, and I've consistently supported her professional development. What I'm concerned about is a pattern of exclusion that seems designed to minimize my involvement in strategic decisions while maximizing hers." Jennifer's expression hardened, and for the first time in our conversation, I saw a glimpse of the calculation that had been driving her behavior for months. "Sarah, I'm going to be direct with you because I think you need to hear this. The leadership team has been discussing how to better leverage everyone's strengths and address some performance concerns that have been identified. Amanda brings fresh perspectives and energy that our clients have responded to very positively. Rather than viewing her success as a threat, you should be looking for ways to adapt and contribute to the team's evolution." Performance concerns. The phrase hung in the air between us like an accusation that couldn't be taken back. Jennifer had just revealed that there had been discussions about my performance that I wasn't aware of, evaluations of my work that had happened without my participation, and conclusions about my professional value that had been reached without my input. What performance concerns? I asked, though part of me dreaded hearing the answer. Jennifer seemed to realize that she'd revealed more than she'd intended, and her expression became guarded again. "I think those conversations are better addressed with James directly," she said. "But I will say that adaptation and flexibility are crucial skills in our industry, and resistance to change can be career-limiting." I left Jennifer's office feeling like I'd been given a preview of my own professional obituary. The conversation had confirmed my worst suspicions while revealing that the situation was even more dire than I'd realized. Not only was I being systematically replaced, but my colleagues had been actively building a case against my performance to justify that replacement. The afternoon passed in a haze of routine tasks and mounting dread. Every email seemed potentially significant. Every conversation felt loaded with subtext, and every interaction with my colleagues carried the weight of knowing that they'd been discussing my professional shortcomings behind closed doors. I found myself analyzing months of feedback and performance reviews, trying to identify the concerns that Jennifer had referenced. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized that there hadn't been any significant criticism of my work. My last performance review had been overwhelmingly positive, praising my strategic thinking, client relationship skills, and commitment to excellence. My projects had consistently met or exceeded expectations, my clients had regularly expressed satisfaction with my work, and my contributions to team success had been recognized and rewarded. The performance concerns that Jennifer mentioned weren't based on objective evaluation of my work quality. They were post hoc justifications for decisions that had already been made for other reasons. My colleagues had decided to replace me with Amanda, and now they were constructing a narrative that would make that replacement seem reasonable and necessary rather than arbitrary and unfair. That evening, I did something I hadn't done in months. I called my college roommate Lisa, who worked as a human resources director for a tech company in Portland. We'd stayed in touch over the years, but our conversations had become less frequent as our careers demanded more of our time and attention. Still, Lisa was one of the few people in my life who understood both the demands of corporate politics and the personal impact of professional betrayal. Lisa listened without interrupting as I explained what had been happening at Morrison Associates, from the gradual exclusion from important conversations to the birthday incident that had crystallized my understanding of the situation. When I finished, she was quiet for several moments, apparently processing the information and considering her response. "Sarah," she said finally, "this sounds like a classic constructive dismissal situation. They're making your work environment so uncomfortable and marginalizing your role so significantly that you'll eventually resign rather than force them to terminate you directly. It's a way of avoiding unemployment claims and potential lawsuits while achieving the same result as firing you." The term constructive dismissal gave a name to what I'd been experiencing, providing a framework for understanding the systematic nature of my colleagues' behavior. This wasn't just office politics or professional competition. It was a deliberate strategy designed to force my departure while minimizing legal and financial consequences for the company. "The question," Lisa continued, "is what you want to do about it. You could file a complaint with HR, though that might accelerate their timeline for pushing you out. You could document everything and consult with an employment attorney about potential legal remedies. Or you could start looking for another job and get out before the situation gets worse." Each option carried significant risks and uncertain outcomes. Filing an HR complaint might provide some protection, but it would also mark me as a troublemaker and make my remaining time at the company even more uncomfortable. Consulting with an attorney might reveal legal options, but pursuing them would be expensive, time-consuming, and potentially damaging to my professional reputation. Looking for another job was probably the most practical choice, but it would mean accepting defeat and allowing my colleagues to achieve their goal of erasing me from the organization. But as I talked through the options with Lisa, I realized that there was a fourth possibility that she hadn't mentioned: staying and fighting back. Not through legal channels or HR complaints, but by refusing to disappear quietly and demonstrating that I wasn't the pushover they apparently thought I was. "There's something else I could do," I told Lisa. "I could make them fire me directly instead of allowing them to manipulate me into resigning." I could document everything that's been happening and force them to justify their treatment of me in explicit terms, rather than hiding behind vague references to organizational evolution. Lisa was quiet for a moment, considering the implications of what I was suggesting. "That's certainly an option," she said carefully, "but it's also risky. If you force a confrontation, you need to be prepared for the possibility that you'll lose your job without any severance or positive references. Are you ready for that outcome?" I thought about her question for a long time after we ended the call. Was I prepared to lose my job at Morrison Associates? The position had been central to my identity for 4 years, providing not just income, but also professional validation, creative fulfillment, and social connections that had become the foundation of my adult life. Walking away from all of that would mean starting over in ways that felt both terrifying and liberating. But I was beginning to realize that the job I'd loved was already gone. The relationships I'd treasured had already been severed. The professional future I'd been building had already been transferred to someone else. The only question was whether I would acknowledge that reality and adapt to it, or whether I would fight to maintain the illusion that I still had something worth protecting. Thursday morning brought an unexpected development that pushed me further toward a decision I'd been avoiding. I arrived at the office to find Amanda sitting in my usual spot during our weekly team meeting, with my nameplate replaced by a temporary sign that read, "Amanda Foster, Senior Marketing Strategist." The change had happened overnight, with no prior discussion or announcement, as if my 4 years of contributions to the company could be erased with a simple swap of office signage. Marcus noticed my confusion and offered a brief explanation that sounded rehearsed. "We're experimenting with some seating arrangements to optimize team collaboration and communication flow," he said, avoiding eye contact while delivering what was obviously a prepared statement. I took a different seat without protest, but the symbolism of the change was unmistakable. Amanda wasn't just taking over my responsibilities. She was literally occupying my physical space within the organization. The nameplate on what had been my usual spot wasn't a temporary experiment in office optimization. It was a declaration that the transition was complete and irreversible. The meeting proceeded with Amanda leading discussions about projects that I'd been developing for months. She presented strategic recommendations that were based on research I'd conducted, using insights I'd gathered from client conversations and market analysis I'd completed. But the work was presented as her own, with no acknowledgement of my contributions or involvement in the underlying development process. James praised Amanda's presentation with enthusiasm that felt performative, describing her recommendations as innovative thinking that demonstrates exactly the kind of strategic leadership we need for future growth. The compliments were obviously intended for my benefit, sending a clear message about who had value within the organization and who had become expendable. After the meeting, I lingered in the conference room while my colleagues filed out, ostensibly to organize my notes but actually to process what I'd just witnessed. The systematic erasure of my contributions was complete. Not only was Amanda receiving credit for my work, but the transition was happening so smoothly that anyone unfamiliar with the history would assume she'd been responsible for the strategic development all along. David was the last person to leave the conference room, and he paused at the door as if he wanted to say something. For a moment, I thought he might offer some acknowledgement of what was happening or some expression of regret about how the situation was unfolding. Instead, he simply nodded in my direction and said, "Good meeting today," before following the others toward their offices. The casual dismissal was somehow more hurtful than open hostility would have been. David's unwillingness to acknowledge the obvious injustice of what was happening suggested that he'd made peace with my marginalization and saw no reason to pretend otherwise. The man I'd developed feelings for over the past year had become just another participant in my professional execution. By lunchtime, I'd made a decision that felt both inevitable and terrifying. I wasn't going to resign, and I wasn't going to fade away quietly. I was going to force my colleagues to confront the consequences of their treatment directly and explicitly. If they wanted me gone, they would have to fire me openly, rather than manipulating me into disappearing. But I also wasn't going to simply wait passively for them to take action. I was going to document everything that had happened over the past 8 months and present it in a way that would make their behavior impossible to ignore or rationalize. I was going to create a record of their systematic marginalization that would force them to acknowledge what they'd done and take responsibility for the impact of their choices. I spent my lunch break at a coffee shop 3 blocks from the office, using my personal laptop to create a detailed timeline of every incident I could remember. The gradual exclusion from email lists, the transfer of client relationships without discussion, the strategic planning sessions that happened without my participation, the performance concerns that had never been shared with me directly, and finally the birthday celebration for my replacement on my actual birthday. Each incident seemed minor in isolation, but together they formed a pattern that was impossible to dismiss as coincidence or normal business evolution. This was deliberate, coordinated, and systematic. My colleagues had spent months implementing a plan to remove me from the organization while avoiding the legal and financial complications of direct termination. As I documented the timeline, I also began to see opportunities for response that I hadn't considered before. Friday's meeting with James wasn't just a threat. It was also an opportunity to present my own narrative about what had been happening and to force a conversation that my colleagues had been avoiding for months. I wouldn't go into that meeting as a victim seeking explanations or reassurances. I would go as someone who understood exactly what had been happening and was prepared to discuss it directly and explicitly. I would present my documentation, demand acknowledgement of the treatment I'd received, and require James to either justify their behavior or change it. The rest of Thursday passed quickly as I refined my documentation and prepared for what I expected would be the most important conversation of my professional life. I wasn't naive about the likely outcome. James would probably find ways to justify everything that had happened and might accelerate the timeline for my departure, but at least I would have the satisfaction of forcing an honest conversation, rather than accepting their preferred narrative of organizational evolution and performance concerns. Thursday evening, I made another decision that surprised me. I called my parents in Vancouver and told them everything that had been happening. I'd been avoiding those conversations for months, partly because I didn't want to worry them, and partly because I wasn't ready to admit that my perfect life in Seattle was falling apart. My mother listened with the kind of patient attention that I'd forgotten she possessed, occasionally asking clarifying questions but mostly allowing me to tell the story without interruption. My father, typically more direct in his communication style, offered several suggestions for how I might respond to the situation, ranging from immediate resignation to aggressive legal action. But the most valuable part of the conversation was their reminder that my worth wasn't determined by my colleagues' treatment of me or my employer's evaluation of my contributions. I'd been so focused on the professional implications of what was happening that I'd lost sight of the personal resilience that had carried me through previous challenges in my life. "Sarah," my mother said near the end of our conversation, "you've always been someone who stands up for what's right, even when it's difficult. Don't let these people change that about you. Whatever you decide to do, make sure it's something you can be proud of, looking back." Her words reminded me that this situation was about more than just my job at Morrison Associates. It was about who I wanted to be when faced with injustice and betrayal. Did I want to be someone who accepted mistreatment quietly to avoid conflict, or someone who demanded accountability even when it came at personal cost? I spent most of Thursday night finalizing my documentation and preparing for Friday's meeting with James. The timeline I'd created was comprehensive and damning, showing a clear pattern of systematic marginalization that couldn't be explained away as normal business evolution or performance management. I had dates, specific incidents, and concrete examples of the preferential treatment Amanda had received while I was being excluded from important conversations and decisions. But I also prepared for the possibility that James would offer reasonable explanations for everything that had happened, or that he would acknowledge the problems and commit to addressing them. I didn't want to be so focused on confrontation that I missed opportunities for genuine resolution if they existed. By the time I finally fell asleep, I felt more prepared for Friday's conversation than I had for any professional interaction in months. I wasn't going into that meeting hoping for the best or fearing the worst. I was going as someone who understood the situation clearly and was prepared to address it directly, regardless of the consequences. Friday morning arrived with unexpected sunshine, the first clear day Seattle had seen in over a week. I took it as a positive omen as I dressed for work, choosing an outfit that projected confidence and professionalism without seeming overly formal or defensive. I wanted to look like someone who belonged in important conversations, not someone who was desperate to prove her worth. The morning passed with an artificial normalcy that felt like the calm before a storm. My colleagues went through their usual routines. Amanda continued working with the focused intensity that had become her trademark, and James moved through the office with his characteristic combination of authority and approachability. Everyone seemed to be performing their normal roles while waiting for something significant to happen. At 11:30, my phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. When I opened it, I found a simple message that made my blood run cold. "Good luck this afternoon. Some of us are rooting for you." The message was unsigned, but the timing and content suggested that word of my meeting with James had spread beyond the people directly involved. Someone in the office knew what was coming and wanted me to know that I wasn't completely isolated. The gesture was small, but it reminded me that there might be people watching this situation who understood the injustice of what was happening, even if they weren't in positions to do anything about it. The hours before my meeting with James crawled by with excruciating slowness. I found myself checking the clock every few minutes, unable to focus on routine tasks, while my mind raced ahead to the conversation that would determine my future at Morrison Associates. I rehearsed key points I wanted to make, anticipated objections James might raise, and tried to prepare myself emotionally for whatever outcome awaited me. At 2:45, 15 minutes before my scheduled meeting, Amanda approached my desk with an expression that I couldn't quite interpret. She looked nervous, almost guilty, as if she wanted to say something but wasn't sure how to begin. "Sarah," she said quietly, glancing around to make sure no one else was within earshot, "I wanted to talk to you about something before you meet with James." I looked up from my computer, surprised by her initiative and curious about what she might have to say. We hadn't had a substantial conversation in weeks, and her sudden desire to talk felt significant given the timing. "What's on your mind?" I asked, keeping my voice neutral despite the adrenaline spike her approach had triggered. Amanda took a deep breath before speaking, as if she were gathering courage for something difficult. "I want you to know that I never asked for things to happen the way they have. I know you've been mentoring me and supporting my development, and I feel terrible about how everything has unfolded." Her words carried a weight that suggested she knew more about the situation than she'd previously let on. The guilt in her expression implied that she understood her success had come at my expense, and that she felt conflicted about the role she'd played in my marginalization. "What do you mean?" I asked, though I was beginning to suspect that Amanda might have more insight into the decision-making process than I'd realized. Amanda glanced around again, confirming that we were still alone, before continuing. "I think there are things you should know before your meeting with James. Things about how decisions have been made and why certain changes have been implemented." The offer of information was tempting, but I also recognized that it might be a trap. Amanda could be genuinely trying to help me understand the situation, or she could be gathering intelligence about my plans for the meeting with James. Given everything that had happened over the past months, I wasn't sure I could trust anyone in the office. "I appreciate that you want to help," I said carefully, "but I think I need to have my conversation with James based on my own observations and understanding of the situation." Amanda nodded, but her expression suggested that she had more to say. "Sarah, I just want you to know that if I could change how things have happened, I would. You've been an incredible mentor, and I've learned so much from working with you. I hope you'll remember that, regardless of what happens next." Her words felt like a goodbye, confirming my suspicion that my meeting with James would result in my departure from Morrison Associates. Amanda knew something about the planned outcome of our conversation, and her guilt suggested that she understood the injustice of what was happening, while feeling powerless to prevent it. At 3 o'clock exactly, I knocked on James's office door and was invited to enter. The space looked exactly as it had during our previous conversation, with its wall of awards and achievements serving as a reminder of everything I'd contributed to over my 4 years with the company. But this time, the familiar surroundings felt more like a courtroom, where my professional fate would be decided. James gestured toward the chair across from his desk, and I sat down with the folder containing my documentation resting on my lap. I'd spent hours preparing for this conversation, and I was ready to present my case clearly and comprehensively, regardless of how uncomfortable it might make either of us. "Sarah," James began, "I've been thinking about our conversation last week and the concerns you raised about your role within the organization. I wanted to follow up on those discussions and talk about some potential paths forward." His tone was careful and measured, suggesting that he'd also prepared for this conversation, and had specific talking points he intended to cover. The phrase potential paths forward implied that he was prepared to offer me options, though I suspected those options would be limited and ultimatum-like in nature. I decided to take control of the conversation before James could frame the discussion according to his preferred narrative. James, I appreciate you making time for this meeting. I've spent the past week documenting the specific changes I've observed in my role here, and I'd like to share that information with you before we discuss any potential paths forward. James's eyebrows rose slightly, suggesting that he hadn't expected me to come prepared with documentation or to take the initiative in directing our conversation. Of course, he said. I'm interested in hearing your perspective. I opened my folder and pulled out the timeline I'd created, placing it on his desk where we could both see it clearly. The document was organized chronologically, with specific dates and detailed descriptions of each incident I'd observed over the past 8 months. This timeline shows a pattern of systematic exclusion from strategic planning conversations, transfer of client relationships without discussion, and marginalization of my role within the team, I said, keeping my voice steady and professional. I've also documented the creation of email distribution lists that exclude me from important communications, and the assignment of my responsibilities to Amanda without any explanation or consultation. James studied the document carefully, occasionally making notes in the margins, or asking clarifying questions about specific incidents. His expression remained neutral, but I could see him processing the information and recognizing the comprehensiveness of my documentation. When he finished reviewing the timeline, James was quiet for several moments, apparently considering how to respond to the evidence I'd presented. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a note of resignation that suggested he'd been hoping to avoid this level of detailed discussion. Sarah, I can see that you've put considerable thought into analyzing these organizational changes. Some of what you've documented reflects deliberate decisions about how to best utilize our team's capabilities and develop emerging talent. Other aspects might be the result of communication gaps that we should address. The response was classic corporate deflection, acknowledging my concerns while reframing them as either intentional business decisions or minor communication issues rather than systematic marginalization. James was trying to minimize the significance of what I'd documented while avoiding any admission that my treatment had been unfair or problematic. But I was prepared for this response and had anticipated the need to be more direct in my presentation. James, with respect, what I've documented isn't the result of communication gaps or normal talent development. This is a coordinated effort to transfer my responsibilities to Amanda, while excluding me from the strategic planning conversations that are central to my job function. I leaned forward slightly, maintaining eye contact while keeping my voice calm but firm. Yesterday's team meeting was particularly telling. Amanda was presenting strategic recommendations that were based entirely on research and analysis I'd completed over the past months. But there was no acknowledgement of my contributions. She was literally sitting in my usual seat, with my nameplate replaced by hers, presenting my work as her own while I watched from across the table. James's expression flickered with what might have been discomfort or acknowledgement, suggesting that my directness was making it difficult for him to maintain his preferred narrative of innocent organizational evolution. Moreover, I continued, Jennifer mentioned that there have been discussions about performance concerns regarding my work, but those concerns have never been shared with me directly. If there are issues with my performance, I should have been included in those conversations and given opportunities to address them. The reference to my conversation with Jennifer seemed to surprise James, and I realized that he might not have known that she'd revealed the existence of those discussions. His slight shift in posture suggested that I'd just gained some leverage in our conversation by demonstrating that I knew more about their decision-making process than they'd assumed. James was quiet for a long moment, apparently recalculating his approach based on the new information I'd provided. When he spoke, his tone was more direct than it had been at the beginning of our meeting. Sarah, I'm going to be honest with you about the situation we're facing. The leadership team has been discussing how to optimize our organizational structure and ensure that we're positioned for future growth. Amanda has demonstrated exceptional capabilities and has received very positive feedback from clients who've worked with her. He paused, choosing his words carefully before continuing. At the same time, we've observed some challenges with adaptability and collaboration that have raised questions about the best way to structure our senior strategy team moving forward. The euphemistic language was infuriating, but not unexpected. James was presenting my systematic marginalization as organizational optimization, and my colleagues' deliberate exclusion of me as evidence of collaboration challenges. He was making me responsible for the problems they'd created, while positioning Amanda's success as justification for my marginalization. What specific challenges with adaptability and collaboration are you referring to? I asked, determined to force him to be explicit about the accusations he was making. James looked uncomfortable, clearly preferring to keep his criticisms vague and euphemistic, rather than providing concrete examples that I might be able to refute. There have been concerns about resistance to sharing leadership responsibilities and difficulty adjusting to evolving team dynamics. The accusation was both infuriating and revealing. James was suggesting that my objections to being systematically excluded from important conversations constituted resistance to collaboration, and that my concerns about having my responsibilities transferred without discussion represented difficulty adapting to change. James, I said, working to keep my voice level despite the anger building inside me, I've been mentoring Amanda since she joined the company. I've supported her professional development, included her in client presentations, and helped her build relationships throughout the organization. The idea that I'm resistant to sharing leadership responsibilities is contradicted by months of evidence. I gestured toward the timeline on his desk. What I've documented isn't resistance to collaboration. It's systematic exclusion from collaborative processes. I can't adapt to team dynamics when I'm being excluded from the team. James's expression suggested that he recognized the weakness of his position but was committed to seeing this conversation through to its predetermined conclusion. Sarah, I understand your frustration, but we need to focus on moving forward in a way that serves everyone's interests. The phrase moving forward was another euphemism, and I suspected I was about to hear the real purpose of this meeting. James had allowed me to present my documentation and voice my concerns, but now he was ready to deliver the message he'd planned from the beginning. What exactly are you proposing? I asked, though I was fairly certain I already knew the answer. James opened a folder on his desk and pulled out what appeared to be a prepared document. We'd like to offer you a transition package that would allow you to pursue opportunities that might be a better fit for your career goals and working style. The transition package was a severance offer disguised as an opportunity for professional growth. James was offering to pay me to leave quietly, rather than forcing a termination that might raise uncomfortable questions about the treatment I'd received. What kind of transition package? I asked, curious about the terms they were willing to offer to ensure my departure. James outlined a severance agreement that was surprisingly generous, including 3 months of salary continuation, extended health insurance coverage, and positive references for future employment opportunities. The terms were designed to make departure financially attractive, while ensuring that I wouldn't have incentives to pursue legal action or create negative publicity for the company. This package reflects our appreciation for your contributions to Morrison Associates and our desire to support your transition to a new opportunity, James explained. We think this arrangement would benefit everyone involved. The offer was tempting from a practical standpoint, providing financial security while I searched for a new position and avoiding the uncertainty and potential conflict of trying to remain with an organization that clearly wanted me gone. But accepting the package would also mean validating their narrative about organizational optimization and allowing them to erase my contributions without accountability. I need some time to consider this offer, I said, though I was already beginning to formulate my response. James nodded, apparently expecting this request. Of course. Why don't you take the weekend to think it over, and we can discuss your decision on Monday? I agreed to the timeline and left his office with the severance documents in hand, but my mind was already racing ahead to the decision I needed to make. The generous terms of the offer confirmed that my colleagues understood the injustice of what they'd done and were willing to pay a premium to avoid accountability. But they'd also underestimated my willingness to accept their preferred resolution. As I walked back to my desk, I noticed Amanda watching me with an expression of concern and curiosity. She obviously knew that something significant had happened during my meeting with James, and her guilty demeanor suggested that she understood her role in whatever outcome had been proposed. I spent the rest of Friday afternoon in a strange state of suspended animation, going through the motions of routine work while processing the decision I needed to make over the weekend. My colleagues treated me with the careful politeness typically reserved for someone who was already halfway out the door, confirming that word of my situation had spread throughout the office. That evening, I walked along the waterfront for hours, watching ferries cross Elliott Bay and trying to decide who I wanted to be in this situation. The practical choice was obvious. Accept the severance package, take the money, and find a new job where I could start fresh without the baggage of this experience. But the principled choice was more complicated and potentially more costly. By the time I returned to my apartment, I had made a decision that would change everything. Saturday morning found me sitting at a corner table in Victrola Coffee on Capitol Hill, nursing my third espresso and staring at the severance documents James had given me. The weekend foot traffic flowed past the windows in an endless stream of people who seemed to know exactly where they were going and what they wanted from their Saturday. I envied their certainty. The documents were spread across the small table like evidence in a criminal case, which in many ways they were. 3 months salary continuation, health insurance through the end of the year, and a carefully worded reference letter that praised my contributions while avoiding any specific commitments about future recommendations. It was a generous package for someone being pushed out, but it was also hush money designed to ensure my quiet departure. I'd been carrying my phone around all morning, fighting the urge to call Lisa in Portland and talk through the decision I was facing. Part of me wanted her practical HR perspective on the situation, her professional assessment of my options and their likely outcomes. But another part of me knew that seeking advice was just another way of avoiding the choice I needed to make. The truth was, I'd already decided what I was going to do. I'd known since Friday evening, walking along the waterfront and watching the sun set behind the Olympic Mountains, that I wasn't going to take their money and disappear quietly. The decision had crystallized during those hours of solitary reflection, emerging from a place deeper than practical calculation or professional strategy. I was going to reject their severance offer and force them to fire me directly. I was going to make them acknowledge what they'd done instead of allowing them to hide behind euphemisms about organizational optimization and talent development. And I was going to do it in a way that would make the entire experience as uncomfortable and memorable as possible for everyone involved. But first, I needed to understand exactly what I was up against and what resources I had available for the confrontation that was coming. I spent Saturday afternoon in the Central Library, researching employment law and constructive dismissal cases, trying to understand my legal rights and the potential consequences of different approaches to my situation. What I discovered was both encouraging and sobering. The pattern of systematic marginalization I documented would likely qualify as constructive dismissal under Washington state law, giving me potential grounds for legal action if I chose to pursue it. But proving constructive dismissal required demonstrating that my employer had deliberately made my working conditions so intolerable that any reasonable person would feel compelled to resign. The challenge was that Morrison Associates had been careful to maintain plausible deniability for most of their actions. Individual incidents could be explained away as normal business decisions, miscommunications, or routine organizational changes. The cumulative impact was clear to me, but proving deliberate intent in a legal proceeding would be difficult and expensive. More importantly, I realized that legal action wasn't really what I wanted. Filing a lawsuit would take months or years to resolve, during which time I'd be unemployed and fighting a battle that would consume enormous amounts of time, energy, and money. Even if I won, the victory would be Pyrrhic, providing financial compensation but no real accountability or acknowledgement of the injustice I'd experienced. What I wanted was something more immediate and personal. I wanted my colleagues to face the consequences of their choices directly and explicitly. I wanted them to understand the impact of their systematic betrayal on someone they'd claimed to value and respect. I wanted them to remember this experience every time they considered treating another employee the way they'd treated me. By Sunday morning, I had the beginnings of a plan that felt both satisfying and terrifying. Instead of accepting their severance package or forcing them to fire me through continued resistance, I was going to orchestrate my own departure in a way that would expose their behavior and force them to confront the reality of what they'd done. I spent Sunday afternoon crafting 2 documents that would serve as the centerpiece of my response. The first was a detailed memo to James, documenting everything that had happened over the past 8 months and explicitly rejecting their characterization of the situation as normal organizational evolution. The second was a letter to my colleagues, explaining my decision to leave Morrison Associates and the reasons behind that choice. Both documents were carefully written to be professional and factual, while still conveying the emotional impact of the systematic marginalization I'd experienced. I wasn't interested in making accusatory or inflammatory statements that could be dismissed as emotional overreaction. I wanted to present an unvarnished account of what had happened that would be impossible to ignore or rationalize away. The memo to James was 8 pages long, organized chronologically and supported by specific examples and documentation. I outlined each incident I'd observed, explained the cumulative impact of the changes on my role and responsibilities, and directly addressed the euphemistic language he'd used to justify their treatment of me. The tone was professional but uncompromising, demanding acknowledgement rather than seeking understanding. The letter to my colleagues was shorter but more personal, expressing disappointment about the deterioration of relationships I'd valued, while acknowledging the professional realities that had made my continued employment untenable. I avoided accusations or blame, instead focusing on the lessons I'd learned about authenticity, loyalty, and the difference between collegiality and genuine friendship. But the centerpiece of my plan wasn't these documents, important as they were. It was the method I'd chosen for delivering them and announcing my departure from Morrison Associates. I was going to turn my final day at the company into a birthday celebration that would be remembered long after I was gone. Monday morning arrived gray and drizzly, typical Seattle weather that seemed appropriate for what I was planning. I dressed carefully for what would be my last day at Morrison & Associates, choosing an outfit that projected confidence and professionalism, while also feeling authentically like me. I wanted to look like someone who belonged in important conversations, not someone who was being pushed out of them. I arrived at the office early, before any of my colleagues, and spent an hour preparing for the day ahead. I copied the memo and letter I'd written, organized my personal belongings for easy removal, and set up the materials I'd need for the afternoon's activities. Everything had to be perfectly timed and coordinated to achieve the impact I was hoping for. Marcus arrived at his usual time, followed by Jennifer and David, and finally Amanda, who continued to maintain her pattern of arriving early to demonstrate her commitment to the organization. Their morning routines proceeded normally, with no indication that anyone suspected what was coming later in the day. At 9:30, I knocked on James's office door and was invited to enter. He looked up from his computer with an expression of polite inquiry, apparently expecting me to deliver my decision about the severance package he'd offered on Friday. "James," I said, settling into the chair across from his desk, "I've spent the weekend considering your transition package offer, and I've decided not to accept it." His eyebrows rose slightly, suggesting surprise but not alarm. "I see. Can you tell me more about your thinking?" I pulled out the memo I'd prepared and placed it on his desk. "I've documented my response to your offer and my analysis of the situation we've been discussing. I think you'll find it addresses the concerns we talked about on Friday." James picked up the memo and began reading, his expression becoming increasingly serious as he worked through the 8 pages of detailed documentation and analysis. I watched him process the information, noting the moments when he paused at particularly pointed observations or shifted uncomfortably in his chair. When he finished reading, James was quiet for several minutes, apparently considering how to respond to the comprehensive rejection of his preferred narrative. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a note of resignation mixed with frustration. "Sarah, this is a very detailed analysis, and I appreciate the time you've invested in preparing it. However, I'm not sure this approach is going to be productive for anyone involved." "I'm not interested in being productive," I replied calmly. "I'm interested in being accurate. Everything in that memo is factual and verifiable. If you disagree with any of my characterizations or conclusions, I'd be happy to discuss them specifically." James glanced at the memo again, apparently looking for specific points he could dispute without acknowledging the overall pattern I'd documented. "Some of these incidents reflect legitimate business decisions that weren't intended to marginalize your role or diminish your contributions." "Intent is less important than impact," I said. "Regardless of what was intended, the result has been systematic exclusion from strategic planning conversations, transfer of client relationships without discussion, and marginalization of my role within the organization. Those are the facts, regardless of the motivations behind them." James leaned back in his chair, apparently recognizing that I wasn't going to accept his preferred explanations or be persuaded to change my position. "So what are you proposing we do about this situation?" I'm proposing that you acknowledge what has happened, instead of hiding behind euphemisms about organizational optimization and talent development. I'm proposing that you take responsibility for the impact of your decisions, rather than blaming me for resistance to collaboration. I leaned forward slightly, maintaining eye contact, while keeping my voice calm but firm. And I'm proposing that you allow me to finish my employment here with dignity, rather than forcing me to accept a severance package that validates your narrative about my supposed performance issues. James was quiet for a long moment, apparently weighing his options and considering the potential consequences of different responses. What exactly are you asking for, Sarah? I want to work through my standard 2 weeks notice period, with full access to the projects and clients I've been responsible for. I want acknowledgement that my departure is the result of organizational changes, rather than performance concerns. And I want the opportunity to transition my responsibilities in a way that serves our clients' interests, rather than simply transferring everything to Amanda without explanation. The requests were reasonable and professional, designed to test James's willingness to treat me fairly even as our employment relationship was ending. If he agreed to these terms, it would suggest some recognition that my treatment had been problematic. If he refused, it would confirm that their primary concern was avoiding accountability rather than managing a professional transition. James considered my proposal for several minutes before responding. I can agree to a standard notice period and appropriate acknowledgement of your contributions. However, the transition of responsibilities will need to be managed in a way that minimizes disruption and ensures continuity for our clients. The response was predictably cautious, agreeing to my requests in principle while maintaining flexibility about how they would be implemented. But it was more than I'd expected, suggesting that James understood the weakness of his position and was willing to make reasonable accommodations to avoid further conflict. I can work with those parameters, I said, standing to leave his office. I'll submit my formal resignation letter this afternoon and begin organizing transition materials for the projects I've been leading. As I reached the door, James called my name. When I turned back, his expression was more personal than it had been during our professional discussion. Sarah, I want you to know that this outcome isn't what anyone wanted. You've made significant contributions to this organization, and I genuinely regret that we weren't able to find a way to move forward together. The statement felt like an acknowledgement, however oblique, that my treatment had been unfair and that my departure represented a loss for the company. It wasn't a full apology or acceptance of responsibility, but it was more recognition than I had expected to receive. I appreciate that, James. I hope the organization learned something from this experience that will help you treat future employees more fairly. I left his office feeling both satisfied and nervous about what came next. The morning conversation had gone better than expected, but the afternoon would test whether James's apparent reasonableness would extend to allowing me to control the narrative around my departure. I spent the late morning organizing transition materials and preparing for the presentation I planned to give during our regular Monday afternoon team meeting. Instead of simply announcing my resignation and departure timeline, I was going to use the meeting to deliver a comprehensive overview of my contributions to the organization and the projects I'd be transitioning to other team members. But the real surprise would come after the formal meeting, when I would unveil the birthday celebration I'd been planning since Saturday morning. Not a birthday party for myself, though it was still technically my birthday week, but a celebration of everything I'd learned about authentic relationships and professional integrity during my time at Morrison Associates. At 11:30, Amanda approached my desk with the same nervous energy she'd displayed on Friday afternoon. She glanced around to ensure privacy before speaking in a voice barely above a whisper. "Sarah, I heard you met with James this morning. Is everything okay?" Her concern seemed genuine, though I suspected it was motivated as much by worry about her own position as by care for my welfare. If I was leaving Morrison and Associates, it would affect the team dynamics and project assignments in ways that would impact everyone, including Amanda. "Everything's fine," I replied neutrally. "I'll be making an announcement during this afternoon's team meeting that will clarify the situation for everyone." Amanda's expression suggested that she wanted more information, but she also seemed to understand that pressing for details wouldn't be appropriate. "Sarah, I just want you to know that whatever happens, I've learned so much from working with you. You've been an incredible mentor, and I hope you'll remember that." The repetition of her Friday sentiment felt scripted, as if she'd been coached about how to interact with me during this transition period. But her nervousness also suggested genuine guilt about the role she'd played in my marginalization, whether that role had been active or passive. "I'll remember everything, Amanda. That's one of the advantages of paying attention to how people treat you when they think you're powerless to respond." My reply was deliberately ambiguous, designed to make Amanda wonder exactly what I'd observed and documented about her behavior over the past months. The uncertainty in her expression suggested that the comment had achieved its intended effect. Lunchtime arrived with an unexpected development that added another layer to the afternoon's planned activities. Miguel, the security guard who'd asked about my birthday the previous Tuesday, approached me as I was leaving the building for a quick meal. "Ms. Chen," he said quietly, "I wanted to give you something before you leave today." He handed me a small wrapped package with a card attached. Inside was a coffee mug with "World's Best Strategic Thinker" printed on the side, along with a handwritten note thanking me for always treating him with respect and acknowledging his contributions to the building's operation. The gesture was so unexpected and genuine that I felt tears threatening for the first time since this ordeal had begun. Miguel had noticed my absence from the birthday celebration, remembered that I'd been overlooked by my colleagues, and taken the initiative to provide the recognition that should have come from the people I worked with directly. "Miguel, this is incredibly thoughtful. Thank you for remembering my birthday when other people forgot." His smile was warm and knowing. "Some people see what's happening around here, Ms. Chen. Not everyone agrees with how things have been handled." The comment confirmed what I'd suspected about the anonymous text message I'd received on Friday. There were people in the building who understood the injustice of my treatment and disapproved of my colleagues' behavior, even if they weren't in positions to intervene directly. I returned to the office feeling more determined than ever to make my afternoon presentation memorable and impactful. The kindness Miguel had shown reminded me that there were still people who valued authenticity and fairness, even in environments where those qualities were becoming increasingly rare. At 2 o'clock, our regular Monday team meeting convened in the conference room where I'd eaten birthday cake alone the previous Tuesday. The irony of the location wasn't lost on me as I took my seat at the table, noting that Amanda was once again sitting in what had been my usual spot while I occupied a chair that felt symbolic of my marginalized status within the organization. James began the meeting with routine updates about client projects and business development activities, maintaining the normal agenda structure while everyone waited for whatever announcement I'd promised to make. The artificial normalcy felt surreal, given the conversations that had taken place over the past few days, and the decision I'd made about my future with the company. When James finished his updates and turned the meeting over to team reports, I cleared my throat and stood up, signaling that I had something significant to share. Before we begin with project updates, I have an announcement that will affect our team structure and client assignments moving forward. The room fell silent, with everyone's attention focused on me in a way that hadn't happened during team meetings for months. Marcus, Jennifer, David, and Amanda all wore expressions of careful attention mixed with nervous anticipation. After careful consideration of my role within the organization and my professional goals, I've decided to resign from Morrison Associates. My last day will be Friday, November 26th, giving me 2 weeks to transition my responsibilities and ensure continuity for our clients. The announcement was delivered in a calm, professional tone that revealed nothing about the emotions or circumstances behind my decision. I wanted my colleagues to process the information without being able to dismiss it as an emotional reaction or impulsive choice. Marcus was the first to respond, his surprise apparently genuine. "Sarah, this is unexpected. Can you tell us more about what's driving this decision?" I'd prepared for this question and had decided to be honest without being accusatory. I've realized that my professional goals and working style aren't well aligned with the organization's evolving direction. Rather than continuing in a role that isn't utilizing my strengths effectively, I think it's better for everyone if I pursue opportunities that offer a better fit. The explanation was diplomatic but pointed, acknowledging the organizational changes that had marginalized me while avoiding direct criticism of my colleagues' behavior. It placed responsibility for the misalignment on institutional factors rather than personal conflicts, making it difficult for anyone to argue with my reasoning. Jennifer's response was equally measured. "We're sorry to lose you, Sarah. You've made significant contributions to our success over the past 4 years." The past tense framing of her comment was telling, suggesting that she viewed my contributions as historical rather than ongoing. It confirmed that my colleagues had already mentally adjusted to my absence and were prepared to move forward without me. David's reaction was the most difficult to interpret. He looked genuinely surprised by my announcement, but also relieved in a way that suggested he'd been anticipating this outcome and was glad that the uncertainty was finally resolved. Amanda said nothing during the initial round of responses, but her expression combined guilt, concern, and what looked like excitement about the opportunities my departure would create for her advancement within the organization. James's response was carefully neutral, acknowledging my announcement while avoiding any discussion of the circumstances that had led to my decision. "We'll work together over the next 2 weeks to ensure a smooth transition of your responsibilities and maintain the high level of service our clients expect." With the formal announcement complete, I moved to the second phase of my presentation. Instead of simply discussing transition logistics, I'd prepared a comprehensive overview of every project I'd led, every client relationship I'd managed, and every strategic initiative I'd contributed to during my 4 years at Morrison Associates. Before we discuss transition details, I'd like to provide some context about the scope of work that will need to be redistributed among team members. I pulled out a bound presentation I'd prepared over the weekend, with copies for everyone at the table. The document was 30 pages long, organized by client and project type, with detailed descriptions of strategic approaches, key relationships, and ongoing commitments that would require attention during the transition period. Over the past 4 years, I've been the primary strategist for 12 major client accounts, representing approximately 40% of the agency's annual revenue. I've led the development of 63 distinct campaigns, managed relationships with over 200 individual client contacts, and contributed to strategic planning initiatives that have shaped the organization's growth trajectory. The presentation continued for 20 minutes, with me walking through each major project and explaining the strategic thinking behind key decisions. I wasn't just documenting my responsibilities. I was demonstrating the depth and breadth of my contributions in a way that would be impossible to ignore or minimize. My colleagues listened with increasing discomfort as the scope of my work became clear. Many of the projects I was describing had been gradually transferred to Amanda or other team members over the past months, but hearing them presented comprehensively made it obvious how much institutional knowledge and client relationship value was walking out the door with my departure. When I finished the formal presentation, I closed the bound document and looked around the table at my colleagues. The transition of these responsibilities will require careful coordination to ensure client continuity and maintain the quality standards Morrison Associates is known for. James nodded, apparently recognizing the implied challenge in my statement. If they had truly believed that my contributions were dispensable, or that my performance was problematic, the comprehensive overview I just presented would be difficult to reconcile with those assessments. Thank you for the detailed overview, Sarah. This will be very helpful for planning the transition process. With the formal business of my resignation announcement complete, I moved to the final and most personal part of my afternoon presentation. Instead of ending the meeting and returning to routine work, I had one more surprise that would transform my departure from a simple employment termination into something much more memorable. "Before we adjourn," I said, pulling a large shopping bag from under the conference table, "I have something else I'd like to share with everyone." My colleagues exchanged puzzled glances as I began removing items from the bag: a small birthday cake, paper plates, plastic forks, and a package of birthday candles. The cake was identical to the one they'd shared for Amanda the previous Tuesday, complete with yellow frosting and purple script lettering. Since we're all gathered together, and this is likely our last team meeting with the current configuration, I thought we should have a proper celebration. Consider this a belated birthday party for me and an early farewell gathering for all of us. The silence in the room was deafening as my colleagues processed what was happening. I was throwing myself the birthday party they'd failed to organize, using the same conference room where they'd celebrated my replacement while ignoring my actual birthday. I placed the cake in the center of the table and began inserting candles, counting out loud as I reached 29. I realized last week that I'd never actually had a proper birthday celebration in this office, despite organizing them for everyone else over the past 3 years. So I decided to remedy that situation. Marcus was the first to find his voice. Sarah, you didn't need to do this. We can certainly acknowledge your birthday and celebrate your contributions to the organization. Oh, but I did need to do this, I replied, continuing to arrange the candles with careful precision. I needed to demonstrate what it looks like when someone takes responsibility for creating the kind of workplace culture they want to experience, rather than waiting for other people to provide recognition and acknowledgement. I struck a match and began lighting the candles, the small flames casting dancing shadows across the conference table. I needed to show what it means to celebrate authentically, rather than going through the motions of professional courtesy while systematically marginalizing the person being honored. Jennifer shifted uncomfortably in her chair. Sarah, I think there might be some misunderstandings about recent team dynamics. If you felt overlooked or undervalued, that certainly wasn't intentional. I finished lighting the candles and looked directly at Jennifer. Misunderstandings require unclear communication. What I experienced was systematic exclusion from strategic planning conversations, transfer of client relationships without discussion, and deliberate marginalization of my role within the organization. Those aren't misunderstandings, they're deliberate choices. David finally spoke, his voice carrying a note of defensiveness. Sarah, organizational changes happen for valid business reasons. It's not personal, and it's not fair to characterize normal evolution as deliberate marginalization. I smiled at him, remembering the feelings I'd once harbored, and the conversations we'd shared about industry trends and strategic innovation. David, you're absolutely right that organizational changes happen for business reasons, but excluding someone from email distribution lists, transferring their responsibilities without discussion, and celebrating their replacement on their actual birthday go beyond normal business evolution. Amanda had remained silent throughout this exchange, but her expression suggested that she was beginning to understand the full scope of what had been happening and her role in it. The guilt I'd noticed in her behavior over the past week was intensifying as she realized how her advancement had come at my expense. The interesting thing about birthday celebrations, I continued, is that they're supposed to acknowledge someone's value and contributions. They're meant to demonstrate appreciation and create positive memories. When you organize a birthday party for someone's replacement on that person's actual birthday, you're sending a very clear message about whose contributions you value. I pulled out a lighter and held it near the candles. So today, I'm creating my own birthday celebration, one that actually acknowledges my contributions and creates the kind of positive memory I want to have about my time here. James cleared his throat, apparently deciding that he needed to take control of the situation before it escalated further. Sarah, we appreciate the gesture, but perhaps we should focus on transition planning rather than revisiting past incidents. Oh, we'll definitely focus on transition planning, I said, lighting the final candle. But first, we're going to have cake and celebrate everything I've learned about authenticity, loyalty, and professional integrity during my time at Morrison Associates. I began singing Happy Birthday to Me, in a clear, strong voice that filled the conference room. After a moment of stunned silence, Miguel appeared in the doorway, apparently having heard the singing from the hallway. He joined in enthusiastically, followed by 2 other building staff members who had been drawn by the unusual sound of a birthday celebration. My colleagues sat frozen as strangers sang with more enthusiasm for my birthday than they had shown in months of working together. When the song ended, I blew out all 29 candles in one breath and began cutting the cake into generous portions. The wonderful thing about providing your own birthday celebration, I said as I distributed plates, is that you can control the guest list and ensure that everyone who attends actually wants to be there. I served cake to Miguel and the building staff first, thanking them for their genuine kindness and recognition. Then I offered pieces to my colleagues, most of whom accepted them, with the kind of awkward politeness typically reserved for uncomfortable social obligations. As we ate birthday cake in the conference room where I'd spent countless hours developing strategies and managing client relationships, I felt a strange sense of completion. This wasn't the birthday celebration I'd hoped for 8 days ago, but it was the one I needed to mark the end of my time at Morrison Associates and the beginning of whatever came next. You know, I said, addressing my colleagues as we finished our cake, birthdays are supposed to be about celebrating the past year and looking forward to the future. I'm grateful for everything I've learned about professional relationships and workplace dynamics during my time here. Those lessons will serve me well in my next position. Marcus attempted to lighten the atmosphere with a forced smile. "We hope you'll stay in touch and let us know how you're doing in your new role." "Oh, I'm sure our paths will cross again," I replied. Seattle's marketing community is smaller than people think, and professional reputations travel quickly in our industry. The implied warning was subtle but unmistakable. My colleagues might think they were getting rid of a problem by encouraging my departure, but they would continue to encounter me at industry events, through mutual professional contacts, and possibly as a competitor if I joined another agency. Amanda finally found her voice as the impromptu celebration was winding down. "Sarah, I want you to know that I've learned so much from working with you. I hope you'll remember the positive aspects of our collaboration." I looked at her directly, remembering the hours I'd spent mentoring her and the enthusiasm I'd felt about developing her strategic thinking skills. "Amanda, I'll remember everything about our collaboration, the mentoring, the knowledge transfer, the client introductions, and the way it all culminated in you presenting my work as your own while sitting in my chair during team meetings." Her face flushed with embarrassment and guilt, confirming that she understood the role she'd played in my marginalization, whether that role had been actively pursued or passively accepted. As the meeting finally concluded and my colleagues began filing out of the conference room, I felt a sense of satisfaction that surprised me with its intensity. The confrontation I'd orchestrated hadn't been vindictive or unprofessional, but it had been direct and uncompromising in a way that forced acknowledgement of what had happened over the past 8 months. James lingered as the others left, apparently wanting to have a private conversation about the afternoon's events. When we were alone, his expression was serious but not angry. "Sarah, that was quite a presentation. I hope you feel like you've had your say about the situation." "I do," I replied. "And I hope you understand that this kind of treatment will have consequences that extend beyond my individual experience. Other employees are watching how you handle these situations, and clients notice when valued team members leave unexpectedly." James nodded slowly, apparently recognizing the truth in my observation. "Point taken. We'll work to ensure that future transitions are handled more thoughtfully." As I cleaned up the remnants of my birthday celebration and prepared to return to my desk for the remainder of the afternoon, I realized that something fundamental had shifted in my relationship with this experience. I was no longer the victim of systematic marginalization who was desperately seeking explanation and justice. I was someone who had taken control of her own narrative and forced accountability from people who preferred to avoid it. The next 2 weeks would bring their own challenges as I transitioned my responsibilities and navigated the complicated dynamics of my remaining time at Morrison Associates. But the birthday celebration I'd thrown for myself had marked a turning point that would influence every interaction and decision that followed. I was no longer trying to save my position or repair relationships that had been irreparably damaged. I was preparing for whatever came next with the knowledge that I'd stood up for myself when it mattered most, regardless of the professional and personal costs involved. The afternoon sun was breaking through Seattle's persistent cloud cover as I walked back to my desk, carrying an empty cake box and a coffee mug that read, "World's Best Strategic Thinker." In 2 weeks, I would leave Morrison Associates for the final time, but I would do so on my own terms and with my dignity intact. Whatever birthday I celebrated next year would be different in ways I couldn't yet imagine, but it would be authentic in ways that my time at Morrison Associates had stopped being months ago. And that authenticity, I was beginning to understand, was worth celebrating regardless of who else showed up to the party. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.